Earlier this year, Dr. Billington named Walter Dean Meyers as the third National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. This is a project of the Center for the Book with the Children's Book Council and its nonprofit arm, Every Child a Reader. The notion of a national ambassador would be someone who traveled the country on behalf of young people's literature, promoting it, and also expanding the audience for reading in every way that we can think of. My prop for today you already have. There's in your kits this morning, and on the table in the back, there is a bookmark which has Walter's photo and also a brief explanation of the National Ambassador Program. It lasts for 2 years. Walter is midway through his 2-year term speaking on behalf of reading. And today we're going to learn a little bit about his experience, but I'd like to start by asking him how he chose his particular theme for his activity, which is reading is not optional. Walter, do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came to be your theme, and a little bit about, I happen to know that it's his own early background that has helped lead to this theme.
As I began speaking to young people and how we approach them with reading and with books, very often I would see teachers and librarians saying to young people, "Oh, books are wonderful, they will take you to far-off places," and someone said, a ship is like a frigate. And I began to ask the young people, what did this mean? And they began to say things to me like, "Oh, if you want to, you can have a lot of fun with books. And if you want to, you can enjoy yourself and perhaps learn something from books." I thought this was bad because reading is something you have to exist in this world. My dad, who was a janitor, could not read or write, always prided himself on the fact that he could support his family. Today, he couldn't, not without reading. And how reading affects all parts of our lives, including national security, is not spoken about very often. You know, one of my sons was a chaplain in the Air Force, and he was saying there were weapons that the Americans have that they couldn't use because people couldn't read the manuals. It's just coming more and more. The gap is becoming more and more. The most American thing that we have in this country is the ability for the lowest classes to lift themselves, to make themselves whole and to prosper. But without reading, they can't do this. So this is why, my own background is, I was raised in a foster family. My mom read on, I guess, a third grade level, but she read with me 4 days a week, true romance magazines, and I didn't understand what the true romance magazines were about. I didn't learn about true romance until I reached my 30s, and I wasn't attracted to the stories so much, but I was attracted to being with Mom, with my foster mom. And I would watch her finger go across the page, and eventually, because the reading level of those true romance was fairly low, I could pick out the words. And by the time I reached the age of 5, I could read to her as she ironed and as she worked. And that was, I never knew she was giving me something. I never knew she was transmitting a skill, but today I know it.
And then, Walter, you went on to school for a few years, right?
Right.
And you were in school until when? Till what age?
I was in school until I was 15. I did fairly well in school until I was 14. When I was 14, my family began to disintegrate. I had an uncle that was murdered. My father went into a depression. My mom, who was always sort of a borderline drinker, became an alcoholic. And so I was thrown away. That so completely filled my mind that my grades plummeted. But I had books. I had the New York Public Library. Thank God for the New York Public Library. And I had books. So when I had the difficulties with my mom, I found my emotional voice in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Stephen Dedalus, whose mother asked him to pray with her, and he refused. And that tension. And when I had the idea of sometimes being fearful, I had the Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane. Books gave me the voice that expressed my individual humanity.
And those books then helped turn you into a writer. Do you want to talk for a moment about how you got into writing?
I began writing. I had speech difficulties as well, but my siblings all had speech difficulties. We came up from West Virginia. And I couldn't speak very well or read very well aloud, but so eventually a teacher said, okay, you can write something, you can copy down well, if you laughed at me, John, I would throw my books at you, or hit you, depending how far away you were. But she said I could write something. I began writing little poems, and I really enjoyed that. That was the only thing I was praised for at that age, and I enjoyed writing. I dropped out of school at 15, was caught, put back into school, dropped out at 16, and joined the Army on my 17th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you have before you one of the most prolific writers of literature for young people. Walter's written over 100 books. He's known throughout the country and the world for his concern about, in fact, youth, and which is reflected in most of what we would call his young adult fiction, which has a focus based on his experience, being born in Harlem and being a New Jersey boy, basically. And this is a career that is remarkable and is one that he's now sharing through his travels around the country. And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about what has happened during your first year of touring. The only conditions really for a national ambassador would be the selection by the jury, which consists of experts in children's and young people's literature, which we host at the Children's Book Council with myself and a number of experts, including Robin Adelson, who is the chair. And that we ask that the person that we choose is known not only for his or her books, but their ability to relate to kids. Basically, it's turned out to be a key thing. And the little obligation reminds me a little bit for the minor obligations for the poet consultant, poetry and poet laureate for the Library of Congress. They need to appear at the Library of Congress. They have a couple of other minimum obligations, and then it's up to them. For Walter and our two previous ambassadors, John Cheska and Catherine Patterson, they have not only helped open Children's Book Week in New York, but of course come to our National Book Festival. So we are getting a guarantee of a top-notch writer through this obligation. But Walter in particular chose a theme reading is not optional. And we